Without saying a word, you can light up the dark.
Can someone die of thirst while holding the bottle? Keith Whitley did. At just 34 years old, the country music world woke up to shocking news. One of its most promising voices was found lifeless in his Nashville home. The official cause? Alcohol poisoning. But that simple phrase hides a storm that had been brewing for years, inside his soul, behind his smile, and deep in his songs. To the outside world, Keith was a star on the rise. His voice, smooth as Tennessee whiskey and soaked in heartbreak, had already earned him comparisons to George Jones and Merle Haggard. His single, I'm No Stranger to the Rain, was climbing the charts. He had the love of Lori Morgan, a record label ready to push him to the top, and fans who clung to every note he sang. But behind the stage lights, Keith was drowning. The night before his death, he was drinking. Again, alone. His blood alcohol content was 0.47, nearly 6 times the legal limit. It wasn't a one-time binge. It was a pattern, a hunger, a sickness. He had tried to stop. Rehab, promises, vows to Lori, plans for a future. But some thirsts can't be quenched by water, especially when they come from somewhere deeper than the throat. Keith Whitley didn't die because he failed. He died because he couldn't escape himself. Because the very pain that made his music beautiful also made his life unbearable. And so, on May 9th, 1989, a voice that could silence a room was silenced forever. But what really happened in the days before that morning? And why did no one, not even those closest to him, stop it in time? Now, we pull back the curtain, and behind it, we find the voice that died thirsty. When Keith Whitley walked onto a stage, he didn't just sing, he haunted the room. Emerging in the mid-1980s, just as the glossy sheen of pop country was threatening to overshadow traditional roots, Keith brought something raw and aching back into Nashville's bloodstream. His voice carried the weight of an old soul, a man who sounded like he'd lived through 1,000 heartbreaks before he ever picked up a guitar. Born in Kentucky in 1954, in the coal-dusted town of Sandy Hook, Keith came from the kind of place where country music wasn't just entertainment, it was survival. Raised among Appalachian hills and hard lives, his early influences weren't polished stars, but mountain singers, bluegrass pickers, and the ghosts of honky-tonk legends. By the age of 13, he was already performing with local bands. By 15, he was drinking. He wasn't just talented, he was troubled early. Alongside childhood friend and fellow prodigy Ricky Skaggs, Keith got his first national exposure playing in Ralph Stanley's Clinch Mountain Boys. The music world took notice, but even then, his drinking was as consistent as his pitch. The young singer, barely old enough to vote, was already known for pushing his body to dangerous extremes, crashing a car at 120 miles per hour, and surviving only because he was too drunk to tense up. When he shifted into solo country music in the early 1980s, the genre itself was at a crossroads. Urban cowboy had turned country into something slick, marketable, and watered down. Keith Whitley was the antidote. His voice, dripping in regret, soaked in whiskey and sorrow, reminded people why they fell in love with country music in the first place. Nashville didn't just accept him, it needed him. By 1988, he was headlining tours, giving interviews, receiving awards, and marrying Lori Morgan, the rising country starlet and daughter of Grand Ole Opry legend George Morgan. From the outside, everything was lining up perfectly. RCA Records was investing heavily in him. His album Don't Close Your Eyes had spawned multiple #1 hits. There was serious talk that he might be the next George Jones. But here's what Nashville didn't show. Keith wasn't just battling alcohol. He was battling the version of himself that only existed on stage, the strong, composed, magnetic performer everyone adored. Offstage, he was riddled with anxiety, loneliness, and unresolved childhood trauma. And while his voice spoke of pain, few understood how deeply it was autobiographical. His marriage to Lori, while passionate and sincere, was volatile. She often had to hide bottles, plead with him to stay sober, and cancel plans when his drinking spiraled. Friends and producers walked a delicate tightrope. Do they push him to get help or protect the golden goose? The truth was, Keith Whitley wasn't just a man drinking too much. He was a man whose soul was already bleeding. The alcohol didn't create his demons. It just numbed the parts he couldn't talk about. And Nashville, as it always does, clapped for the voice, but ignored the silence that followed. No one knew, or no one admitted, that the clock was ticking louder than the applause. Before the tragedy, there was triumph. Keith Whitley's career wasn't a slow burn, it was a meteor. After signing with RCA Records in the early 1980s, his early releases struggled to find footing. The label didn't quite know what to do with a man who insisted on raw, traditional country at a time when the industry wanted clean-cut crossover stars. But Keith didn't bend. He insisted on heartbreak, on pain, on truth. Then came Don't Close Your Eyes. Released in 1988, the album was nothing short of a revelation. The title track, a slow, tortured plea for emotional honesty, soared to #1. So did When You Say Nothing at All, a tender ballad that would become one of the genre's most beloved love songs. And then came I'm No Stranger to the Rain, the most prophetic of them all. With these songs, Keith did more than climb charts. He resurrected authenticity in country music. He brought back sorrow, sincerity, and the slow burn of storytelling. Critics hailed him as the next George Jones. Fans wept during his performances. Artists wanted to record with him. He wasn't a rising star anymore. He was the star. But as his voice conquered the airwaves, his demons were conquering him. Even during his peak, Keith struggled to maintain sobriety. After marrying Lori Morgan in 1986, he promised change. He entered detox, canceled gigs, and told interviewers he was cleaning up for good. He meant it. And for a time, he managed it. But stress, touring, pressure, emotional volatility always pulled him back to the bottle. There were signs. At shows, he would sometimes slur lyrics. He'd disappear after concerts. Producers had to schedule studio time around his good hours. One friend recalled how Keith would show up drunk to rehearsals, apologizing with tears in his eyes. Another said he kept vodka in coffee mugs during morning interviews. Yet even in his messiness, the music never faltered. That was the terrifying beauty of it all. His voice remained perfect even as his life collapsed. Behind closed doors, the marriage with Lori began to strain. She tried everything, hiding his car keys, locking up liquor cabinets, confronting him, pleading with him. But Keith's pain ran deeper than anyone could reach. He began spiraling, locking himself in rooms for hours, drinking alone, calling friends late at night in despair. In April 1989, Keith was working on new material. The world was waiting. His label had already planned his next tour. He was scheduled to perform with Garth Brooks, a newcomer at the time, in a few weeks. Everything was in motion. Then came May 8th. He flew back to Nashville after a brief trip. His brother Dwight had breakfast with him the next morning. They laughed. Keith said he felt good. He talked about future shows, joked about getting old, even made plans to pick up his son later that day. Then Dwight left. Keith was alone. Sometime between late morning and early afternoon, he poured another drink, and then another, and then another. He died on the floor of his bedroom. When they found him, the television was still on. No note, no warning, just silence. The coroner's report later revealed the blood alcohol content, 0.47. A level so high it could kill even a seasoned drinker in minutes. There were no other substances in his system. No pills, no drugs, just the bottle. And a man who had been running from himself his entire life. The voice was gone, and with it, a piece of country music's soul. They say some voices live forever, but Keith Whitley's ended in a silence too heavy to ignore. In the hours following the discovery of his body, Nashville froze. Word spread fast. First whispers in recording studios, then urgent phone calls between radio stations, and finally headlines that sent shockwaves across the country music world. Keith Whitley dead at 34. The industry didn't just lose a star. It lost a symbol of hope that traditional country could still thrive in a changing world. The media's reaction was instant, but cautious. Early reports mentioned acute alcohol poisoning, but refrained from diving deeper. Many outlets leaned on words like troubled genius, tortured artist, and country's most authentic voice. But behind the polite tributes was a darker, unspoken truth. Keith drank himself to death, and almost everyone around him had seen it coming and done nothing. Lori Morgan was inconsolable. She collapsed upon hearing the news. In a later interview, her voice cracked as she recalled the last phone call with Keith. He had told her, "I'll be all right, baby. Just a quiet day at home." She believed him. She wanted to believe him. She needed to. At the funeral, the pews were packed with legends and newcomers alike. Ricky Skaggs, his childhood friend and longtime bandmate, stood by the coffin with tears in his eyes. Vince Gill performed Go Rest High on That Mountain in his memory. Even hardened producers broke down, realizing too late that the man whose songs touched millions had died without anyone truly hearing his cry. And then came the whispers. He tried to quit drinking so many times. His label was pushing him too hard. Maybe he wanted to go. Maybe it wasn't just alcohol. Maybe it was despair. The haunting detail of his blood alcohol level, 0.47, began making its rounds in newspapers and tabloids. Medical experts confirmed it was enough to kill most people twice over. Rumors spread that he had relapsed days earlier, triggered by isolation and exhaustion. Friends admitted to brushing off warning signs. That's just Keith, they used to say. But now, just Keith was dead. Lori Morgan later found poems and scribbled lyrics in his belongings. One verse read, open quote, "A glass half empty in a room full of fame, no one to blame, but no one who came," close quote. In the days that followed, RCA released I'm No Stranger to the Rain as a tribute. It soared to #1, posthumously. Fans flooded radio stations with requests. Country bars played his songs on loop. Across Tennessee, you could hear his voice drifting out of speakers, each word now loaded with prophetic pain. And as Keith's final album climbed the charts, a cruel irony set in. His death became the marketing push his label had never dared to try while he was alive. In private conversations, executives debated how to honor him without exploiting his tragedy. In public, they celebrated his authenticity. But the truth is, Keith Whitley had been left to battle demons in plain sight. And when he fell, they acted as though no one had seen it coming. But his fans knew. They always knew. Because in every note he sang, there was something too honest, too vulnerable, too close to breaking. Keith Whitley didn't just die from alcohol. He died from the unbearable weight of feeling too deeply in a world that keeps asking for more. And now, every time Don't Close Your Eyes plays, it doesn't sound like a love song anymore. It sounds like a goodbye. To understand Keith Whitley is to stand at the intersection of genius and grief. Here at Aussie Uncovered, Legends and Secrets, we do not romanticize the death of an artist, but we refuse to ignore the haunting truth behind it either. And in Keith's case, his legacy is tangled, breathtakingly beautiful, yet undeniably tragic. Whitley was more than just a voice. He was a reminder of what country music is supposed to be. Unfiltered, uncomfortable, and honest. He didn't sing about heartbreak because it was a genre trope. He sang about it because he lived it. In quiet hotel rooms, in lonely dressing rooms, in battles with his reflection after a fifth of bourbon. What makes Keith Whitley different from so many artists who fall into addiction is the timing. He didn't fade away after years of burnout. He was peaking. His chart numbers were rising. His shows were packed. His marriage, while strained, was still full of love. And yet, he was gone. This raises a painful question we at this channel cannot ignore. How does someone with everything still feel so empty? It speaks volumes about the music industry, how often it prizes performance over person. Keith was allowed to fall apart privately as long as he delivered hits publicly. He was celebrated for his authenticity, but left alone in his suffering. Everyone heard the tremble in his voice, but no one asked what caused it. And that is the double-edged sword of artistry. The very thing that makes a voice special, its vulnerability, is what often makes the soul behind it so fragile. Yet we also believe that Keith Whitley's story is not just one of death, but of impact. Because in a career that lasted barely a decade, with only 2 full-length albums released during his lifetime, Keith reshaped the direction of country music. He inspired a generation, from Alan Jackson to Tim McGraw, to embrace emotional storytelling again. His posthumous influence is so deep, many artists today still name him as a pillar of their sound. Even his wife, Lori Morgan, carried forward his musical legacy, performing tributes and finishing some of the work they dreamed of doing together. But beyond the music, beyond the stats, Keith Whitley leaves behind something more powerful, a cautionary tale with a melody. His story asks us all to listen better, to not just hear the songs, but feel the person behind them, to recognize that sometimes the saddest voices come from the souls trying hardest to smile. We may never know what final thought crossed Keith's mind that morning, but we do know this. he left nothing unsaid in his music. And perhaps that is the most honest farewell any artist can give. What about you? Did you ever hear Keith Whitley's songs differently before knowing the man behind them? Let us know. Because these aren't just stories, they're lives. And some of them, like Keith's, were lived in chords more than in words. Some stories are never told, but now, you know. Keith Whitley didn't leave behind a grand farewell. No carefully worded note, no staged final act, just silence and songs. A trail of melodies soaked in sorrow, aching with things he couldn't say out loud. And maybe that's why his music endures, because it came from a place so real, so raw, that it outlived the man himself. His legacy isn't carved in statues or Grammy speeches. It lingers in jukeboxes at closing time, in the crackling vinyl spinning in lonely living rooms, in the trembling voice of a heartbroken singer covering Don't Close Your Eyes. That's where Keith lives now, in the quiet spaces between the lyrics, where his soul continues to echo. He didn't die a legend. He became one after leaving. And as country music continues to evolve, chasing charts, digital streams, and polished productions, Keith Whitley remains a compass pointing backward. Keith reminding us that truth is louder than production, that pain has a pitch, and that sometimes the most unforgettable artists are the ones we lose too soon. He was a man who drank to forget, but gave us songs we'll never forget. So the next time you hear his voice, don't just listen. Remember the silence that followed it. Feel the absence it left behind. And know this, Keith Whitley didn't just sing country music, he bled it. And long after the bottle emptied, and long after the applause faded, his voice still thirsts, not for whiskey, but to be remembered.